me. But one night, I was working for the Birmingham News, and I lived out in Hueytown. And about midnight, I get this phone call from the chief photographer. And he says, Spider, we need to get you to go down to Marion, Alabama. Says there's been a church burned, and there's been a black man who was protesting, killed. He was shot with a shotgun. His name was Jimmy Lee Jackson. And the reason they sent me, I was the closest person to Marion, and also I was the youngest staff member, and nobody else wanted to go. And me being a real young man, I really didn't, I was always the adventurous type, and I thought it was another adventure, so I thought this was great. So I jump in my car about midnight, and I take off down to Marion. I get there about 1:30 in the morning, and I looked around. I didn't see anything happening, but there was glass all over the streets, and so I didn't know what else to do, so I just got out with my camera and started making pictures. And, well, I was using a flash, and the flash attracted attention. And there was a lot of state trooper cars everywhere, but I hadn't seen anything happen. So I went over to get in the phone booth, tell them nothing was happening. Well, about that time, a sheriff car pulls up to the phone booth, and I looked out at them, and there was a sheriff in there and about 5 or 6 big old, what you call, rednecks in there. And they were drunk. They were drinking beer, and they were laughing, and they were trying to intimidate me. So they got the sheriff's car, and they kind of pushed it up where I couldn't get out of the telephone booth. It's one of those kind you see. It's a glass one that you see everywhere. And I was telling the guy at the Birmingham News what was happening. And about that time, these guys just sort of pushed it over with their car and the car started kind of driving up on it. And I like freaked out. So I just did a karate kick, and I kicked the glass out. And I rolled out and all this glass and stuff. And they're all in there laughing and screaming. They thought it was funny as hell, you know. So I ran and I jumped in my car, and I just tore off down this little dirt road. I had no idea where I was going. I was just trying to escape. And I knew they'd just kill somebody, so I figured, well, they might try to kill me. So I went about a city block, and I ran into a big, tall fence, just wide open, bow. And they were behind me. So I jumped out, and I crawled over the fence. And fortunately, hadn't been out of college too long, and I was in real good shape. And so I took off across the field running, and I got away from them. And I ran through a cemetery. And then after I got through the cemetery, I ran into a white girls' college called Judson College. And I ran up and down the halls beating on the door. I was saying, help, let me in, let me in. Well, nobody would let me in. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and girls are not going to let you in their rooms at 2 o'clock in the morning. But one girl did, and she was from New Jersey. And I think the girls up north probably are different than girls down south. So anyway, she let me in, and I was in there hiding. So now the guy I talked to on the telephone, he had called the publisher of the newspaper, Vincent Townsend. And Vincent, one thing he would not allow is to let authorities abuse the news, the press, photographers. So Vincent called Nicholas Katzenbach in Washington, D.C. He was the Attorney General under President Johnson. And he told him what was happening. And he said, we don't know what has happened to Spider Martin. The last thing we heard from him, he was in a phone booth and being run over, and the phone went dead. So for all they know, I'm dead. So Nicholas Katzenbach called George Wallace in the middle of the night and told him the story, and says, if you don't find this man within 24 hours, we're going to have the Army come in there, paratroopers, we're going to drop them into Marion, and we're going to declare martial law. Well, of course, Wallace didn't want that to happen, so he got all his state troopers out looking for me. And so that morning, about daybreak, I looked out the window, and there was like about at least 200 state troopers out there looking all over the campus. They were everywhere looking for me. So here they came, beating on the door, and I thought, oh man, this is it, they're going to kill me, you know. So I had the girl open the door because they were going to beat the door down. So they came in, and this guy as a state trooper, had a box of donuts and coffee with him. And I was in the corner. I was cornered, and it was like an animal that you get cornered, you know. I'm here, I don't know whether I was going to fight or whatever. Well, the guy reaches out with these donuts and coffee like you would an animal that's frightened, and said, here, have some coffee and donuts. And I was going, God, what's happening, you know? So he told me what had happened. And so that's the way I was introduced to the civil rights struggle in the South. Now, I have at least 3,000 photographs that I kept for myself because I knew that this was history. And being an artist, my photographs aren't just ordinary photographs, they're art. So when I photographed the movement, even though it was very dangerous, my life was on the line every day, I was still trying to be the artist and get great composition and good lighting and good photographs. So what I'm going to show you represents only 37 photographs out of 3,000. And these photographs started down in Selma, Alabama. And right here is the church in Selma. It's called the Baptist A.M.E. Church. And being an artist, like I was telling you, instead of just making a picture of a building, like maybe some of the other photographers would that hadn't had artistic training, I saw this unusual photograph here. This man's a reporter, Tom Langford. He worked with me, and you can barely see my reflection here. I saw that reflection in his glasses, so I thought, hey, this is the picture of the church. So this is where everything started in Selma, right here at the A.M.E. Baptist Church. And this is where the march called Bloody Sunday, this is the day it happened. And this next photograph right here, this man right here he's Andy Young. He's now the mayor of Atlanta. And Andy has given a blessing to the marchers. Most of these guys right here are instrumental in organizing this march. Matter of fact, this man here is John Lewis, who is the U.S. Congressman from Georgia today. So Andy gave a blessing, and they decided to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the Alabama River to Montgomery. Now, they had had a march every other day or every day for a long time, and they would always turn around and go back. But this time, like that old gospel song, Ain't No Turning Us Around, they had decided on this day they were not going to turn around. It was a lot more tense this day because they knew that they were going to be confronted, and they didn't know what the consequences might be. So this is John Lewis again right here, and this man's Jose Williams. And this next photo was what we call white rednecks. This man right here is giving me an obscene gesture, which most people call shooting the bird. Now these folks right here had just as well have beaten me, shot me, whatever they could have done as a black person, because what I was to them, I was worse than a black person. I was like a traitor. And they called me an outside agitator, and they also called me a white nigger. And they would spit on me and throw stuff at me. And this was your typical white southern redneck. Now, most of the southerners, I really think, weren't this way. This is a minority of people in the South. But that's the way it was in 1965. Now, this next photograph here, this is the troopers, and they have been told to stand their ground. And they also told the marchers they have 60 seconds to turn around and go back. And as you can see, some of these guys have got their hands up right here. They're looking at their watches. And also, if you'll notice, it looks very similar today to what you see on television, on the news about what's going on in South Africa. And it was pretty much the same thing. The guys have got their billy clubs, they got tear gas canisters, they got their mask on, and they were ready for anything. One of the troopers had told me that day, who was a friend of mine, and he was an amateur photographer, he said, Spider, I want you to stay back today because we've been told by the governor, Governor Wallace, to harass you. Now, harassment in those days meant beat you. He didn't say those words, but he's told me they were going to harass me, so I knew what he meant. So the next photograph, the state troopers have warned the marchers to turn around and go back. The marchers would not turn around and go back, so they're now approaching the marchers. In this photograph here, the state troopers are now attacking the marchers. They sort of knocked them down like dominoes, men, women, and children. There was a big surge, and people started going down. The troopers were hitting with their clubs as anybody in sight. It's hard to see maybe, but right here is John Lewis. And here's a state trooper, and his club is, you can see movement, and it's coming down on John's head. So he hit John in the head very hard right here. And I was shooting as fast as I could. I didn't have a motor drive camera in those days. It was just a regular 35 millimeter camera. Well, John has been knocked down, and now the state trooper has reached down and he grabbed him by the arm, has jerked him back up, and is beating him more, hit him in the head. Well, John got a concussion from this. So he left John laying on the ground, and then I ran over to photograph John. Well, at that time, tear gas was everywhere. I could barely see what I was doing. And the trooper looked at me, and he came down with a blow toward my head, and I held my camera up. Unfortunately, I hit the camera first, and it glanced and hit me in the head, and it almost knocked me out. I went down on my knees. So I went down on my knees, And he reached down just like he did John. He reached down, he grabbed me by the shirt, and he jerked me back up, and he looked me right in the face, and he pulled his club back, and he was fixing to bash me again. But the man had seen me for the last year, and even though we didn't know each other, our eyes had met. And at that moment, he just said, "Excuse me, I thought you was a nigger," and he dropped me. And then they continued to pursue the marchers across the bridge. And the tear gas now is just everywhere. And believe me, when tear gas is in the air, you cannot see, you cannot function. So it was really easy for these guys to beat these people up. And right here you can see a club just raised in the air coming down on a marcher. And this photograph right here, it shows a lot of, look like debris on the road here, where the debris is human beings. And it's mostly women. There's some men, but I mean, they didn't discriminate when they started slinging their clubs. This is a black lady right here, and they beat her up pretty bad. But all along the way, her body's laying. And the marchers now are running back across the bridge back to the church. Now, I walked over here, and this is the man, I think, that hit me. And he has taken his mask off, and he's looking at this poor lady. This lady here is wiping her eyes. She can't see, and she's crying. And I really feel like, from the way his expression looks on his face there, that there is some remorse there in his face, and he's sorry for what he did. But I'll never know. Now, the next photograph, in the meantime, I'm running, chasing these troopers, photographing everything that goes on. And by this time, most of the marchers had disappeared. And they're back at the church, but there are nothing now but state troopers armed with tear gas guns, machine guns, and whatever other kind of guns they got. This guy right here actually has got his gun drawn, and all their eyes are looking at me. And they don't like me because my pictures have been appearing all over the world. They were in Life magazine and Time, Newsweek, Look, Collier's, lots of papers in France and Germany and England. So I am their enemy. And this man right here, I think, was about to shoot me. But at this moment, I was backed up to a black housing project. Well, I'd spent about a year right here every day. And so everybody knew me, all the black folks did. So this big arm just comes out of nowhere. It was a black lady that lived there. And she grabbed me and jerked me in her apartment. And when she did, the first thing I remember was I smelled turnip greens and cornbread. And she shut the door, and the next thing I know, I'm sitting down at the dinner table, and I had turnip greens and cornbread and black-eyed peas, iced tea. And she said, "Don't you go back out there, they'll kill you." But I was a gung-ho young photojournalist, so I said, "No, I have to go back out. It's my duty. I have to do it." So I looked out the door, and this is what I saw. And not a very good sight. So I decided to go back in, eat a little more turnip greens, and give him time to leave. But this is what your typical sheriff down in Selma. He was actually a member of the Dallas County Posse. And this gun here is a tear gas gun he has. So that evening, Martin Luther King had flown into town, and Martin Luther King wasn't on this particular march. Now, this is Dr. King, and he is delivering a speech to the congregation at the AME Baptist Church in Selma, and he's telling them that we're going to have another march. And this is the beginning of the second march, which was successfully made to Montgomery. But back in Montgomery, the White Citizens Council, white rednecks, the white minority who opposed any justice for the black people, were protesting in front of the state capitol. And as you can see, this sign here says, "Run King out of Alabama." And here it says, "Will this be our new Uncle Sam?" And they have a black man depicted as a savage with a bone in his nose. And this is what they thought of black people. And another photograph. And it's a very graphic photograph. And sometimes I hate to show this picture, but this is history, and this is the way it was. And this is what these people thought of black people. Also, we had black people that didn't think too much of white people in Alabama and what Alabama was doing to them. So this man here, he wore this coat here for 1 year, his Confederate flag, and the sign says, "Alabama goddamn." And I don't blame him. If I'd have been a black person, I'd probably be dead today, because I could not have stood for the way they were treating black people. But I did what I could as a white man by making these photographs. And this man here, his name is Shorty Price. And Shorty ran for governor 8 times in Alabama. he had 8 votes, and he voted for himself each time. He was a real character, and not too nice of a person. The sign says civil rights unconstitutional. That's what Shorty thought about the blacks. Again, though, if you look at this photograph, the nice dark sky and the composition, and Shorty's standing here and he's holding a sign, it's all artistically composed, because while I was shooting these photographs, I was always trying to do the best I could to make a nice art photograph. So with all the training I had in the Birmingham City Schools and in Alabama, I was able to record history and do it in an artistic fashion. Now here we are, we're in the Beulah Baptist Church. This is in Montgomery. And if you ever try to imagine what went on in these churches and with Dr. King, what they were doing, this is exactly what went on. There was a lot of gospel singing, there was a lot of praying, a lot of talking, and a lot of planning. And I attended these churches for at least 1 year every night. I've learned all the songs, and I still know them, and I still love them. This is Dr. King right here. And most of these men here are his colleagues who helped organize the marches. Now, after all the planning and strategy, we had a new march. And when I say we, I was part of it. I wasn't just a photographer. I was involved in it myself. And here's the Edmund Pettus Bridge here. And the first time we had maybe 500 people. Now we have thousands. And right down here, I climbed a big road sign that was over the road. And just as I got there, I barely got Dr. King in the corner. But anyway, this shows all the marchers as the march is starting. Now this march was protected by the U.S. Army. President Johnson sent the Army in, and there were soldiers about every 100 feet, and helicopters, jeeps, tanks, people under bridges, making sure that this march would not be marred by violence. Now this photograph here, I think probably is my most favorite photograph of the march. And I had staked this photograph out because I'd been back and forth on Highway 80 many times and had just loved this big old Southern mansion. But unfortunately, this Southern mansion represents what oppressed the black race for the last 250 years. In the back was slave quarters. So I knew that if I stood here and as Dr. King came by, it would make a great photograph and show the contrast of the old South and the new South. So here's Dr. King. This is Ralph Abernathy, and this is James Bevel. And here's old John Lewis again. He's gotten out of the hospital, and he's marching again. Now, to contrast that last photograph, this is an old slave quarter house here. And this man here was one of the most violent men I've ever met. His name was Sheriff Jim Clark, and I saw him club many people. For some reason or other, he was always clubbing women. And the man standing next to him was the general who was in charge of the Army. His name is General Henry Graham of Birmingham. And General Graham's one of the nicest men I know, and he told me, he said, when you give this speech, please let everybody know that I had nothing to do with this man here. So, on the record, General Graham didn't have anything to do with him. Now, the next photograph here, we're coming down Highway 80, and in those days, Highway 80 was a 2-lane highway. It kind of went through the country. And all along the way, the U.S. Army was standing guarding the marchers. They had guns, and they had bullets. They were loaded. They were prepared for anything. However, this was a very peaceful march. Now, this is a typical picture. I was walking backwards. I walked 50 miles backwards with a wide-angle lens, and I know these guys, in a way, probably got sick of me standing in front of them all the time. At the same time, they knew that my capturing the photographs here were going to give them the visibility that they needed all over the world. As a matter of fact, Dr. King told me, he said, Spider, we could have all the protest marches in the world if we didn't have guys like you and the press down here photographing it. The world then would not know about it, and it wouldn't do any good. So he said that the media probably was more responsible for having, say, the voter registration bill passed than the people that actually got out there and marched. But of course, it took both sides, both of us. Now, this man here, I shoot pictures and ask questions later. So I don't know why. It looked kind of unusual. He's holding a flag upside down. So I shot 2 or 3 pictures, and then I went over and I talked to him. I said, why are you walking with a flag upside down? He says, I'm protesting inequality in the United States of America. And he didn't say Selma, Alabama, Montgomery, Birmingham, or or Alabama or the South. He said the United States of America, because it wasn't just in the South. It was all over the United States. But as Dr. King had told me, he said, Spider, the reason we're having this thing in Alabama is because Alabama offers a better theater. He said, if we had this in Chicago, they wouldn't care. They just said, let them march. And we wouldn't accomplish anything. But we knew if we went to Alabama, people like Bull Connor, George Wallace, Al Lingo, Sheriff Jim Clark, like he said, it was a better theater. We get more publicity, and that's what they did. So that's why they had it in Alabama. Now, this photograph here is what I call an art photograph. Newspapers would never have run a photograph like this. But to me, it's a very inspirational photograph. This Dr. King here, kind of looking up to the sky, and Ralph Abernathy here. They're marching, and it's just, to me, a real artistic, inspiring photograph, and I really love this photograph, too. Now, this man here, he marched 50 miles on one leg. He was on his crutch, had only one leg. We had people, his white men, of course, white lady. It wasn't just black people on this march. There were people from all over the world. Now, this black lady here, the reason I photographed her is because she had a smile on her face every day. And I'd known her for a long time, and her nickname I named her was Sunshine, because her face was always, even though she was black as could be, she looked like sunshine to me. And she was a dear lady and a beautiful person, so she's a typical marcher. Now, this man right here, I think he told me he was from the state of Maine, and he was a priest. And as you can see, he's got his shoes off, and he's tired, and I was standing over him with a wide-angle lens, and I snapped 2 or 3 shots, and he looked up, and he says, I can't make it any further. He said, I'm not in good enough shape, and a lot of people weren't. But I said, well, wait a minute, I said, I'm walking backwards, and I got 50 pounds of cameras around my neck. Now, if I can do that, I think you can make it to Montgomery. So with that, I think I maybe made him feel bad about it, and he got up and he finished the march. But people weren't used to walking 10 miles a day. I mean, a lot of people sit at home, they don't do anything, and this is a typical marcher's feat. This lady, we were camped out on the side of the road. Every night we just camp out on the side of the road. And she was asleep. She was exhausted. I saw her feet, and so I made this unusual photograph. And, of course, I was using a flash, and she never stirred. She never even knew I made her picture, or a picture of her feet, that is. But this, I even have some pictures, not in this collection, but of Dr. King, similar, sitting on the side of the road, nursing his feet. Now, this, to me, is an unusual photograph. It's a photograph of 2 people. But what's unusual about it, of course, being Dr. King and his wife, Coretta, is that they're both smiling. Well, but Dr. King was a very serious man, and I didn't see him smile too much, especially a big smile like this, and Coretta's smiling. This was the last night of the march, and we were at St. Jude's Church, and they had a big show out there with a lot of entertainers, movie stars. Well, the guy that's making them laugh is Sammy Davis Jr., the black entertainer. He was telling a joke. So to me, it's almost like a young couple. He wasn't but 39 years old. No, I think he was younger than that here. So it's a young couple, very much in love, having a great time. And that's why I like this photograph so much. Now, this photograph here, the marchers are coming up Dexter Avenue, the main street in Montgomery, coming toward the Capitol. And again, it's Dr. King and Coretta, and many, many more marchers this time, by the way. And this photograph here is just masses of people. I think they said around 30,000. It may have been more, I don't know, but the street was completely filled up as far as you can see. And Dr. King was delivering his speech, and he did make mention that where he was standing was very ironic. It was where Jefferson Davis stood when he was inaugurated President of the Confederate States of America. Now, while Dr. King was talking, Spider-Man was running around looking for more artistic photographs. And I spied these people. I was back probably half a block away. I had a 350 millimeter lens. And I shot about 3 of this shot before they saw me. And then once they saw me, of course, people respond differently. And so the 3 photographs I got, one of those being this, was picked up by Associated Press. And when Associated Press picks up a photograph, that means that can be used anywhere in the world, whoever subscribes to the Associated Press. Well, they ran it all over the world, literally. And they put my name under it, that Spider Martin had photographed this. Well, a friend of mine from college was in the war in Vietnam. This is 1965, and the war is just beginning there. About a month later, I got a letter from him and a copy of the Vietnam News, and this photograph was on the front page. So that tells you what kind of readership and where these photographs were going, which made the whole world, it brought attention. The whole world knew about what was going on down here in Selma, Montgomery, Alabama. And of course, that's what Dr. King meant to accomplish. And we have an entertainer here. You guys probably don't really know who this lady is. Her name is Joan Baez. But in 1965, she was a very, very popular folk singer. And she was on the march along with a lot of other entertainers. And today, you might say Michael Jackson is one of your most popular singers. Well, back then, Joan Baez was just as popular as Michael Jackson. So that's how popular she was, and that's the type of people we had on the march. This photograph here, I saw a lot of photographs that day made of this speech in the newspapers. Most of them were nothing but his face. But being an artist and having all this great training I got in all the city schools in Birmingham and our colleges, I looked for more than just a headshot. So I made this composition, and to me, the contrast, the microphones everywhere, gives the illusion that you know this man is speaking to the world, which he was, because I think this was British Broadcasting right here, and all these mics represented news stations from all over the world. So after this, the march ended here, and I had to go back to Selma. So when I got ready to go back to Selma, I was going down Highway 80, and I needed a soft drink, so I pulled in this little town called Hainville, and real sleepy southern town, hardly anybody was there. And I looked around, got in my car, and this is what I saw. I saw this black and white mule, and there's a song called Black and White Together. And these animals, as you can tell, are getting along real fine. And I hope that the black race and the white race and all races can get along like these two animals here. So this is the end of the march. But like I say, I have maybe 3,000 more photographs that I hope someday we'll have in our Civil Rights Museum here in Birmingham, so everyone can come and see history. Thank you for listening. Adios.